Peter, welcome to the Founders Lounge.
Hi, Matisse. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. So I typically do a very quick intro of every guest, and there's a lot to say about you and about the things that you've done in the past. Obviously, so serial entrepreneur, founded several startups. You were one of the first startups that went through YCombinator, the famous startup accelerator. So I'd love to hear that story. And then perhaps the most interestingly, you're very involved with AI, and you've been involved with AI since before it was cool, actually, right? So I expect to hear some fun or interesting stories, and I hope we can dive into AI as well, because a lot of people want to learn about it, and there are a lot of opportunities in AI right now for entrepreneurs. So, which obviously you're very involved with that. So, yeah, lots of stuff to talk about, right?
Yes. Where would you like to begin?
Let's just begin at somewhat the beginning. One of your first startups, or maybe your first business, was Clickpass, right? That's the company that went to YCombinator. Yeah. So I'd love to hear what was the story there, because I did a little bit of research, and there's a number of fascinating things about Clickpass. I mean, first of all, so Clickpass was founded in, was it 2007? So that's the second year or so of YCombinator. So that's pretty much before YCombinator was cool as well. I'd just love to hear the story, how all of that started. Your co-founder was also, I believe, somebody who's now runs a $1 billion company. If I got all that information correctly. So,
I actually started. I did physics undergrad. I left undergrad and I really got into I liked programming. I had an aptitude for programming. And so I started doing a PhD in artificial intelligence and computer vision. But that was always a means to an end to me. And the end was always creating software that I could sell to people and that people could use. And I kind of tried to do that during my PhD, but it was very hard to get it out through the university IP department. And so during the course of that, I started getting into, I was like, well, what software is as easy to distribute as possible? And web applications were the easiest to distribute. And so I learned about YCombinator just simply by, I used to read as much as I possibly could every day through this mechanism that was the thing of the day back then, which was an RSS reader. And an RSS reader, I don't think some of your listeners will know what an RSS reader is because nobody uses them anymore. But essentially an RSS reader was the ultimate hose pipe of blogs on the internet. So you'd subscribe to all blogs and then they'd come in and everything would be marked as unread each morning. And I kind of built up my understanding of the Valley and the ecosystem through just downloading this RSS reader. I have no idea where I discovered that. I must have discovered it off some blogs. And then the RSS reader came preloaded with a bunch of people's blogs on them, like Fred Wilson and Joel Spolsky at the time when he was still blogging, and Paul Graham.
The legends of the Silicon Valley.
All these people, and Robert Scoble, who was really, really well known and prolific then. I mean, not that he's not now, but he was particularly so then. And it just started kind of figuring out the patterns and who was who important and who was significant and so on. And a year or so after I'd been kind of consuming all of this, Paul Graham launched YCombinator, which was for the best programmers in the world. And it did not occur to me to apply to YCombinator. But then two guys that I knew from Oxford who weren't programmers applied and got in, Harjeet and Kulveer Tagger. Harjeet, who's now a group partner at YCombinator. And so I thought, well, if they're not programmers and they got in, then maybe I could get in. So I went out to visit them in San Francisco. I used it as an excuse to kind of drop in on YC. Paul Graham liked what we were doing, invited us to come to a party in the evening. And then we made the application on the way on the plane home, kind of got it in under the wire. And then a week later, we had an email from Jessica saying, come out and interview. And so we flew out and interviewed. And then I remember being on the street in Palo Alto when I got the call from Paul Graham, and he said, "We'd like you to come to YC." And that was a really pivotal moment for me. I was delighted to get into YC.
Wow, that just like the OG Silicon Valley story. What you told right now, that's incredible. And so what was the business actually, and how did that go?
Well, business is a bit of a stretch, I would say, as a term, but I can tell you what the application was.
Yeah.
So before you could use Google and Facebook to log into places, you had to remember a password for every single website, and there weren't really decent password managers either. So it was like a really acute problem. And Google login and Facebook login are all built on a technology called OAuth, and the technology that preceded OAuth was called OpenID. And OpenID was this technology that essentially allowed one website to log you into another website, which is what happens every time you use Google to sign up to an app somewhere. But OpenID at the time was really difficult to use. So you had to know what it meant. You had to go and Google for what an OpenID provider was. Then you'd go to this OpenID provider and you'd copy a URL that they'd give you. And this was still in an era where most people didn't know what a URL was. So you'd copy this URL and then go back to the website that you wanted to log into and paste in the URL, and then it would redirect you back to the original provider where you'd log in. And it like this whole thing that was designed to remove friction actually added about 3 different steps to something that was previously like one step. And so Clickpass was this central identity provider where we made it very easy for websites to add us as an identity provider. We created this button that the website could install that just let somebody log in using us. And then we gave the user a dashboard of all of the different sites that they'd logged into that they could then just log into in a click from us. Mm-hmm. So that was the essence of the service.
All right. You mentioned before that YC, if anyone doesn't know, I mean, I think pretty much everyone is very familiar with YCombinator right now, but obviously one of the, arguably the most successful startup accelerator in the world.
I think technically it is the most profitable investor in the world now.
There we go. So like hundreds of billions of dollars in startups that graduated from YCombinator. I think your batch had Dropbox in it as well, right? That was probably the most,
well spotted.
I would imagine the most successful or the most well-known, at least out of the ones in your batch. But I think Airbnb went through YCombinator, Reddit. Like even some of the very first batch had some of the biggest startups in Silicon Valley. So incredibly successful, of course. But how was that experience? I mean, I've heard some stories from YC. I would imagine that those first few batches were even more different than the current ones. That was just, everything was very, I guess, improvised, just, hustling to make it happen, I suppose. I'm curious, how was it?
It's funny, YC was such a low touch experience. Like there really wasn't that much to it. Now, it's a very, very different beast now than it was then when I went through it. And it was still like unproven and somewhat controversial. Like when TechCrunch would publish YC, they publish YC startups, like the comments at the bottom of the TechCrunch articles were always like, why are you bothering with these YC startups? Like who cares about them? From the haters. I mean, history shows there was a lot of good reason to bother with them. The actual experience was very low touch. We turned up, but YC used to alternate between Boston in the summertime and San Francisco in the wintertime because that's what Paul Graham did. And so he lived in Boston in the summer and San Francisco in the winter. And so the first YC batch was in Boston and we were in the second year, the 5th batch, but the second year. And we were back in Boston again. So we just kind of met up with all of these other founders. I think there were 20 companies in our batch, like mostly pairs of founders, young, almost exclusively just young guys in kind of like around 25 or so. And we just went our different ways, programmed during the day, and then once a week we would meet up at Paul's house on a Thursday and have dinner and talk to each other. And then there would be a speaker, and the speaker would just kind of mostly Paul's friends, who were all interesting. Some of them were very well known, some of them less well known. And then at the end of the summer, we had a demo day. So it was all super low touch, but I think there's a few really lasting things that I took from it. The brand was starting to become valuable. Like it did open doors. So it got you a first meeting in decent funds. It was a very unusual group of people. Like it felt so cathartic to be around them, to be around people for whom product really, really mattered. Engineering mattered. It mattered as a means to get to product. People who really believed that good product could make a difference and could be an edge in business. Because most businesses were run, and more correctly, the people who got funding to run businesses were generally people who weren't product or engineering people then. I mean, Silicon Valley has always had an edge in this because investors in Silicon Valley, many of them are product and engineering people, and they reinvest in that. But people like to invest in people like themselves. And outside of the Valley, people with money are not generally people who've made products or engineered things. And so you see a lot of people who are ex-consulting, ex-finance, ex-operations, getting investment. And the nature of the company is then always, it leans towards the concept that Paul Graham so succinctly described as coders in a cage, where somebody's running the business and then it's like, you guys go and make the code to make it. And the Valley in general and YC in particular turned that inside out and said, let's make the programmers the founders. And I think YC has an amazing ability to cut through everything that doesn't matter and get to the core of what really is important. And frequently that's product. It's not always product, but product is generally a very important part of that. Distribution is also a very important part of that. And YC accumulated a group of people who thought so clearly, worked really hard, and had strong product instincts, and then reinforced each other around product and distribution such they kind of created more and more opportunity. But the program itself was surprisingly low touch, but the network and the brand and that way of thinking, I saw a discussion between Sam Altman and Patrick Collison recently. And there was so much clarity of thought in it, so much clarity of thought that you so frequently miss in people who lead organizations of that size. It's very rare that they speak with such clarity and such a depth of understanding about the whole problem stack and essence of things. Usually stuff is much more crafty at that level, and a few people have that type of clarity. And YC really deeply embodies that. And that's, I think, amazing to be around.
That's really interesting what you just said. Do you think that clarity of thoughts, do you think that's just the kind of people that they are? They're clear thinkers, or is that something that they developed, and being around those types of people also helps you develop that? One thing that I've noticed certainly is interviewing people on the podcast, one thing I realized that people who write a lot tend to be clearer thinkers as well. So I made a bit of a connection there. I think that if you write a lot, you need to gather your thoughts and put them into, clear statements, and you have maybe stories to share or concepts to share. So that seems to help. And Paul Graham also is obviously became very well known due to his essays, right? That were short, essentially blog posts, very clearly written concepts, typically on entrepreneurship. But it's funny you mentioned now the same thing about Patrick and Sam Altman. So yeah, where do you think that clear thinking comes from? Is that something that you also picked up or developed or? All right, before we continue, I want to take a second to talk about our sponsor. I've always been saying that one of the best ways to learn about business is by working closely with a smart and successful entrepreneur, and this might be your opportunity. Our sponsor is a company called Judge Me. Judge Me is a Shopify product review plugin, and they're the number one plugin on Shopify. They're literally, if you look at the Shopify App Store, they're in the first spot. They're bootstrapped, and they managed to outcompete other companies that raised hundreds of millions of dollars by just being smarter and building a better product. They were started by PJ, who was also a guest on the Founders Lounge, episode 54, so I recommend you to check it out. They recently moved their headquarters to London, and they're looking for smart people to join them. They're looking for product managers, engineers, and they're looking to fill other roles as well. So check out careers.judge.me and see if you find any role that you like and apply. So that's careers.judge.me. Now, enjoy the rest of the episode.
Paul has it in buckets, and Paul has an amazing ability to just fearlessly ask the dumb questions. And like, I remember coming back to pitch another company to YC, when I didn't get accepted back into YC4. And I was telling Paul about what it would do and like giving the spiel and everything else. And he just said, look, he said, what do I click on? Where do I type? What happens to it when I type? What do I click on next? And it's that type of like brutal reality that forces you to ask the hard questions. I think there is so much emperor's new clothes in startups, and people get so caught up with their own stories and the craft and the complications and everything else that Paul embodied that way of thinking, and he attracted people around him who also liked that way of thinking, which amplified that way of thinking in the group. And I think it probably helped that there was quite a lot of success as well, in that like it's possible to talk a lot of talk if you don't ever really hit the road with stuff. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot more talk about technique in football in pubs than there is in changing rooms. Like in pubs, like the conversation is the thing that makes you look smart. In the changing room, you're like, well, look, I just wasn't fit enough, or I like need to do another 100 penalty shots a day, or whatever the thing in the program that footballers talk about is. And there's enough gameplay in YC, there's enough actual football being played that it forces you to focus on what really counts. And I think that's powerful too.
Okay, so I guess you spent some time in Silicon Valley. Was that just during YC, or did you spend more time there?
We sold the company that we had to another company in Silicon Valley, and so I stayed and worked with them for a couple of years, and then stayed in the Valley for about another kind of 6 months, and then came back to the UK. Okay.
So was that, from what I kind of gathered before, probably the product was interesting, somebody acquired the product, the technology? Was that sort of an acquisition?
Yeah, I mean, when I knew that the company wasn't going to work without dramatic changes, and I didn't know what the right company was. In retrospect, I think the nearest company to where we were in the space is something like Auth0. Like that's actually the product that there was a market for. But I'm not sure there was a market then for that, and I'm not sure we were the team to build that, even if there was. So I couldn't see anything within the horizon that we could possibly build. So I kind of set about seeing if I could sell the company. And I remember Paul saying to me at the time, he was like, this is very unusual. But we found some potential acquirers, and we had, I think, like we had a good team, and we had good brand, and we like had some good integrations with other companies. Like we had the YC buzz around us as a company quite visibly. And so that's essentially kind of what I was marketing to people. I mean, that's pretty ephemeral. Like it's a lot better to market like different things, but I felt it was possible to do that. And in the end, we got bought by a company called Yola, who saw themselves as having they were an online website creator, and they liked the idea of being an identity provider at some point in the future. And so that's why they bought us.
Cool. Okay, one final Y Combinator Paul related question, and then we move on. Paul Graham lives in England now. Is he the kind of person who you can, text when you have like a big question or something, and you can message him and he's gonna get back to you? Or
he may be some people. It's been a long time since I've had any contact with him. I pinged Jessica recently. I can't remember what the context was, but yeah. One of the weird things I think about Paul's position is that he has so many founders who know him, and so his connection, I think, is there's only so many founders you can keep track of. So I don't. Maybe I'm sure some of the others do.
I can't imagine. I think they call him the godfather of startups because he's pretty much in some ways the creator of the modern type of Silicon Valley startup kind of thing.
Yeah, it totally is.
So this first startup was, as you said, it was a truly innovative thing. It was something that didn't exist at that time, possibly even ahead of its time, right? And then you went on to start a few other startups. Has your approach to innovation changed over the years? And I'm asking because we hear a lot about innovative startups in the media, right? That's cool. That's interesting. But there's also this whole other world of startups that are less innovative. And just on the last episode, I actually talked to somebody who said, look, our company, and they sold the company eventually. And he said, look, it was nothing innovative, right? We've sold something in the US and that didn't exist in Europe yet. And we just said, let's just do the same thing in Europe. Like, well, why not? There's innovation is hard. That's a fact. That's why most startups fail. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that? Yeah.
That's a really good question. My approach to startups has changed dramatically. When I first started going out and pitching for investment for Clickpass, it was the first time that I'd really had to sit down and write some kind of coherent plan as to why the company was going to be worth a lot of money and make a lot of money. And I knew enough and I'm smart enough to know that I didn't know the answer to that. And that's a really dangerous patch to be in. I think there's two stable places to do a startup. One is where you have enough momentum but little enough knowledge that you just charge through. Or if there is something on the other side, you charge through it. And then there's a dip, where you actually know enough that you're we just shouldn't go down a whole load of paths. And then to know enough to know that something really is a good opportunity actually takes much, much, much more experience. There's very few things that I think really genuinely look like good opportunities at the get-go. And so then my primary goal was just to get to Silicon Valley. It was to get out of Dodge, to get to somewhere where I felt my people and I kind of felt there was opportunity, which I didn't feel in London at the time. London changed dramatically since then, but at the time there was nothing. The thing that is inescapably terrifically hard in startups is that nobody gives a crap about anybody's innovation. And you mentioned something, you kindly used the phrase, the technology was early. I do not use that phrase anymore. It's just wrong. It's so easy to be early. There's no skill in being early. You can just go, well, at some point AI is going to do everything. Therefore, I'm going to do something on that basis. And you're going to be wrong. You're going to run out of money because early is equivalent. It's not as good as, it is just equivalent to being wrong. So, and I think that your friend who said, look, we just kind of saw it and copied it, it's actually really sensible. Because what you are looking for is an arbitrage opportunity. You're looking for something where you can build something and capture more value than it costs you to do it. And it is so rare in technology for people to find out whether or not people really want to buy the stuff that they're building, to ask the really hard questions and to figure that out. And so you get a weird, like most companies just don't work. Most people just build something that they want to build. And then you get this weird survivorship bias where, because of the nature of technology, when people are right, they can be so big. Like if you just throw 1,000 young programming teams against the wall, all doing things that they want to do, just by chance, some of them are going to be right. And because there's so much variance in what they're doing, like when they are right, they're going to be in such a wide open space that there's huge opportunity to grow this company very large. And that leads you to conclusions like, well, do what you love and do what you have a passion for and scratch an itch and things like that. And it's a really bad, like they're not good conclusions because you didn't see the starting cohort that team came from. So now I follow a very, very different process that involves much, much more careful validation, that there is scope for something, that it's possible that I can build it, that customers want it, that they will want it on a repeated basis, that it's possible to like acquire them profitably. It is hard to find something that actually fulfills all of those constraints.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see a lot of, and I've certainly been there myself, and I've learned my fair share of lessons as well. When you fall in love with the idea, right? You have this idea, and you're like, yeah, that's going to be amazing, and you just think it's going to work because it kind of works in your mind, and then you build and you build and you build, and eventually you realize that nobody actually wants to use that, let alone pay for that.
Yeah, and I think that it's such a consistent pattern that I've come to realize it's a very self-reinforcing pattern, because the order of events goes, I want to start a startup. Like I would like to have a startup. I'd like to be in charge. I'd like to have a cool environment. I'd like to be able to make a lot of money, maybe sell it someday. I need an idea to do that. Well, I'm going to find an idea. Well, this idea seems to be good enough. Now you go around enthusing everybody on the idea, maybe like going and raising money on the idea. And now the whole startup is tentpoled on this idea. And so when somebody says to you, look, are you sure the customers want that? You're like, back the hell away from my idea. Like, can you see how many things depend on my idea in this startup? Like we've got investors, we've got brand, we've got marketing, we've got every story I ever tell at every dinner party about what I'm doing and why it matters. And so you just don't want to break it. And I think founders don't realize that it's not the idea that makes the startup strong. I mean, it is, but the thing that they really have, the asset they really have, is themselves and their ability to pull a team around them and their ability to create momentum and to pursue a dream. And that once that's rolling, they will change the idea. Like they will there's one of three things going to happen. They're either very lucky and they happen to have the right idea, or they change the idea rapidly enough that they get to something that works, or they go out of business. And so it's like the chances of being in the bucket that you don't change your idea is so small, like as to be insignificant. So most founders do change their idea. It's just that they don't change it at the start. They change it when all other options have gone, when all runway is exhausted, when nobody else will invest. And then they're like, holy crap, what will people actually buy? And everything that can be turned into firewood gets ripped up from the decks and thrown into the boiler. And then some of them figure it out. But it's a lot easier to do it at the start than it is like all the way down the line.
2 episodes ago, I had Alex McDonald on the podcast, and they started with one idea. They raised, I think at that point already $30 million, and then they pivoted to something different, right? And that was it obviously ended up being a very successful pivot for them, but it's also pretty hard when you need to turn the whole organization around, explain that to your shareholders, just change the whole strategy, what you're doing, how you're doing it. So that's pretty difficult. And another famous example, there's lots of them, but a lot of people don't know, right? So I think YouTube started as a dating site, which is became sort of well known. But YouTube in the beginning was a dating site, and they developed a really good technology for video hosting or video streaming. And they realized that nobody's actually interested in that in the dating space, but they can still just leverage the technology and use that in a different way. And there's countless examples like that, right? Where you really had to fall out of love from that first idea, or just not fall in love with it in the first place, and say, well, what are our strengths here? What do we have here? How do we use our either technology or whatever you have as a founder to create something out of it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk AI. I think that's your main focus right now, or one of the things that you're primarily focused on, right? You're advising a few companies on AI and product. I believe you're implementing it in your current product as well. Where should we begin, actually? So a lot has happened and lots been happening. Everyone's talking about AI these days. Maybe where do you see things going? Maybe let's start with that. That's maybe a hard question, but you probably think about that more than an average person does. Currently, AI is already doing a lot of stuff, but it's also pretty bad at a lot of things. Where are we going over the next months?
Well,
probably it's hard to say over the next years.
I'll answer a slightly different question, but I think kind of speaks to where we're going, which is where we're at. And the reason I want to talk about where we're at is that I think we're in a really interesting lag period at the moment. So when the internet came out, it took quite a long time before people started building social networks, before people realized essentially that you could use this, that you could use this tool in a completely different way to let people interact socially. So the internet came out and you got bulletin boards and PHPBB and then just websites. But nobody really thought about kind of this more interesting way of doing things and the growth associated with it until kind of you start getting Friendster and so on. Funnily enough, there were actually some companies, although they're indicative of why I wanted to get out of the UK. There were companies like Friends Reunited that did start to think about this and what could happen when you had loads of people sign up to one place and then you could connect them and do all of these different things. But there was this huge lag before then you started building up things that were genuinely social. I think, and not just that, there was a huge lag before SaaS really took off on the internet as well. So before software as a service. And I think there were some infrastructure pieces that really helped with that. But there was this long dead period in the internet. I mean, after the dot-com boom or the dot-com crash, from like 2000 through to, essentially, I felt that when we were in Silicon Valley in 2007, it really felt like the beginning of the next wave. Those people who I was there with at the time and now the glitterati of the Valley, and new companies were picking up. The reason I mention all of that is that a lot of the technology that it took to do the things that we subsequently did with SaaS and social on the internet was already around in 2000, but people hadn't really cottoned on to what it could do. So some of it was rougher, like JavaScript was a bit rougher, but a lot of people just didn't really cotton on to what was possible with it. And once they started cottoning onto it, then you saw kind of an explosion in companies that, for instance, just JavaScripts, like people used to do everything statically. Well, once you can reduce the friction of something pre-Facebook, if you wanted to like a page, liking didn't exist, but if it did exist, you would refresh the entire page. Well, nobody wants to sit around for 7 seconds to like something. So as you drop the friction of these things down to zero, you enable a whole new category of things to happen. And that was part of why social was possible, because it was faster like, faster comment, faster tag. So the reason why I reference all of that is that I think we're in a similar lag period with AI. I don't think people have realized what's possible with AI. And I think it's going to take new applications emerging in order to ignite a lot of people's imagination about what can be built with AI. Because I think people are sitting at the moment in between kind of two camps that are both too extreme, where one is saying, well, it hallucinates and it's unreliable and it's slow and expensive, therefore it's not useful. And the other camp, which is just as unhelpful, which is that AI can do anything. And neither of these camps are correct. But if you really zero in on the stuff that it can do, then you get really interesting opportunities. And so the place where I think that we're going to see a lot of really interesting stuff emerge, and I think that we're going to see kind of the core of the next generation, the bulk of the next generation of SaaS companies emerge, is in taking away schlep work from people. Like these applications are not, everyone's eyes are being drawn to like the latest model or like the latest modality of AI or whatever that thing that got announced at CES that's like a phone but doesn't have any of the features of the phone except for an LLM. And like people's eyes are all going to the sparkly things, but I don't think the sparkly things are going to be where the money emerges in AI. Like there will be foundation models like GPT-4 and Gemini, and then there will be the applications that get built on them. And I think the foundation models we're going to look back on as being like AWS, and the applications that get built on them we're going to look back on as being like all of the SaaS companies that have been built since 2007.
So for somebody listening to this who wants to get involved in that, what should they be doing today? Are there any specific areas that they should start kind of diving into? Are there any communities you think they should start hanging out with? Any things they need to start reading?
I'm going to take a particular position on this, and maybe it's controversial, maybe it's not, but look, I don't think this is about going and joining a bunch of online communities. I think the essence of this is about finding problems. And in some ways, I think online community is going to be dangerous because online communities tend to whip themselves up into a frenzy of intellectualism about stuff and kind of go more and more derivative on things. Like the more you write about stuff, the more it's about sounding clever. And I think the most interesting opportunities in this are going to sound really dumb. They are going to be things like taking orders that come into shipyards and like pull them out of an email and stick them into a CRM. Like they're going to be like these schleppy, dirty problems that most people don't know about, but take a lot of the world's time to work on. And so I think what I would suggest to people, well, I'd suggest two things. One, if you're listening to this and you're interested in those type of problems, reach out to me because I am building an AI. I'm part of an AI venture builder. And so we're actually going to be identifying these problems and priming them and lining up a set of first customers of the problem. And then we're going to be bringing teams in to build those problems and spinning those companies out. So I guess the short answer to your problem is reach out to me.
That's a good shortcut.
Yeah. So my website is nixey.ai, nixey.ai.
We'll put that in the show notes as well.
Great. And so people can just contact me through there and I will shortlist them. And we're looking for really good kind of product founder engineer types, because there's going to be a lot of product problems to be solved here. I mean, the other way to do this is to just like start looking for these problems, but then really validate them. And I think whether you're working in AI or anything else, like this is the step that people miss. They get just enough validation to like want to charge ahead, but they're not willing enough to discard ideas that are not going to make enough money, are going to be too difficult to build, are going to be too time consuming to build, or require too much capital, that the customers don't really want, or the customers only want briefly and they're not prepared to pay for on an ongoing basis, or are really hard to get customers activated on. So really, really drilling into those things in whatever you're doing is a great way to end up with something that fulfills those requirements.
And I see sometimes a good way to solve, I mean, obviously talking to people or observing your own life, I think that's one of the ways to find those problems. But one thing I've heard often in particular is people who work in larger companies, and larger companies tend to be a little bit slow and not necessarily that innovative. And, especially companies who are decades old already, and they have a lot of problems, right? Those companies have a lot of processes, a lot of things that they're doing, and they're not necessarily very innovative at solving those problems that are maybe not core to their business, right? And that's I find that quite interesting. Either if you work in a company like that, or if you can talk to them, or you have friends who are working there, and just have a chat with them, like what are the biggest problems that you're facing at your job right now or in your department right now, and is there something we can solve there?
Yes. I think those conversations make a lot of sense. One thing that I've come to learn over the years is that the biggest problems don't look like problems. I have never had a conversation with anyone where I've asked them what their problems are and they've revealed anything that would make a useful company or a company that you can build today. Because problems that people are aware of but haven't solved fall into one of two categories. They're either things that cannot be done, or they're things that can be done, but they can't be bothered to do them. Mm-hmm. So they're not actually good category. They're not actually good candidates for startups. Like startup, it's so easy to get seduced by them because somebody gets enthusiastic about it, and they're like, but the problems that you really want to solve are problems that somebody's already fixed using a crappy, expensive solution, or that one person is fixed using a crappy solution and that somebody else is still struggling through. If nobody's struggling through a problem, if somebody's like, yeah, I've got this problem that I haven't addressed and I don't have a solution to it and it'd be great if you solved it, what they're really describing is something that they can't be asked to fix, which makes it highly unlikely they're going to pay you for it. So when you have those conversations with companies, the things to find out are not what problems they have. They're to find out what tools or people, or better still, spreadsheets get used a lot. Like find out the mucky points in their system that they depend on that could be much better. And like, where do you spend a lot of time in your hiring process? Or like whatever the job is, let's say you speak to somebody in hiring, you're like, just talk me through it and talk me through what soaks up most of the time for you. And like, show me your inbox and what would you do with this and what happens next? And all of a sudden this stuff starts falling out of it and it's just mucky and it's messy. And you're like, oh, wow, there's like 5 steps to deal with this. And they have to do it 60 times a day. And they won't tell you it's a problem to them because it's just become a rhythm to them. And for some people, actually, it becomes the thing that makes them valuable. Like if they do this job really well and everybody else appreciates that it's a crappy job, but they've nailed it, they don't see it as a problem. They see it as their value add in the organization. Yeah. But it doesn't mean it's not an opportunity.
This is it. That's the thing. So everyone who listened, if this is the one thing that you take away from the episode, I think that's where the opportunity is. I want to be conscious of your time. I know we're a little bit over time already, so we can wrap up here. Perhaps we'll do another episode at some point. I mean, there's going to be a lot of innovation happening in AI, so I'm sure if we have another chat a year from now, a lot is going to change since then. It's funny also, one of the most popular episodes so far was about a venture studio. Was by Jordan Schliff, and he runs a venture studio in the UK. And interestingly enough, that's apparently quite interesting because that gets a lot of views on our YouTube channel. So perhaps we can talk a little bit more about that at some point in the future. Before we wrap up, speaking of the YouTube channel, everyone who listened until the end, if you enjoyed the episode, I'll really appreciate if you share it or like or subscribe. I'm on a mission this year to get to the top 5% of the most shared podcasts globally. We got to the top 15% a year ago, so I'm pretty sure we can get a little bit higher this year, and with everyone's help, we can get there. Peter, is there anything else that we should talk about before we wrap up?
There's a couple of things that I'd like to share with people. That,
yes, please do.
We can touch on, and we may even want to. I don't mind pushing on for a few minutes if there's anything you want to cover.
I have time, so up to you.
I know you're being conscious of mine. So one thing that's just a little bit of self-promotion is that if people have found what I've said today interesting, please come and follow me on LinkedIn, which is where I do a lot of writing and where I think we cross paths as well. And the other thing I was going to say is that alongside doing the venture studio and doing the AI advisory stuff that I do, the product that I'm building myself and bootstrapping is intentional, which could well be helpful to a bunch of your listeners. And it's pre-release at the moment, but it's a tool to help you focus your attention on the stuff that matters to you. So it's quite hard getting things that you want done during the day, especially for people who are solopreneurs or kind of focused on jobs that they're doing off their own back. And so it's a nice tool that helps just remove all distraction and just keep you focused on the stuff that you care about.
It's a topic that I love. So it's a bit unfortunate we didn't get to talk more about that, but it's I looked at your website yesterday and I was like, oh my God, why am I not using this tool yet? Because it is the way how I try to think about my time. And a lot of people will find this weird, but I actually track all my time from the morning until the evening, because I think, time is finite, right? We all have only those 24 hours in the day. And I think where you put your time is, in my opinion, one of the most important things you need to master in your life. And I think that's exactly what your tool is helping people accomplish.
Exactly it. So funny. Like you summed it up. You summed it up so perfectly, because when I started, I actually didn't intend to build it as a product for people. I just built a system for myself to track my own time, because I realized that all of these things, you can get caught up in the nuances and techniques and the perfect way to do things. But I realized that in broad terms, things that I gave time to, I got results from, and things that I didn't give time to, I didn't get results from. And
yes,
but what I didn't have was any consciousness of where my time was actually going, or really kind of good control over on a forward basis where I was about to put it. And so what I really wanted was a tool that made all of that much more clear to me and gave me more control over what I was accomplishing.
I think that's great. I think everyone needs to master their time, and I think your tool can help them with that. So again, we're going to link to that in the episode description as well as your LinkedIn, where you talk quite a bit about AI and the topics that are interesting. So Peter, thanks again. We'll do another episode. It seems like we have a bunch of other topics to talk about, so looking forward to that.
Me too, Matisse. Thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's been a fun conversation.
Likewise. Thank you. Take care.